Then let's move already into the second part of the meeting today, which is actually going over all of this history, all of these different features that we've done on the governance side so that we can do some recap. We can try to understand, okay, how can we make the most out of the glossary, how we can make the most out of the classification, and which features we can rely on both in Open Metadata and in Collate to make our lives easier and make sure that our governance practices and governance teams are going to properly scale through time and while the company is also growing, while the data that you are trying to manage is also growing, because we all know, we all have already seen that data is never staying still. There will be new people joining, reorganizations, new sources that need to be tracked, and we need to make sure that we are following and we have the right strategies in place so that we can properly adapt and grow and evolve together with the needs of our organization. But let's start from the beginning, no? And in terms of governance, in Open Metadata and in Collate, you are going to find two main big pieces here. One being the glossary and one being the classification. And when we're talking about classification, we're talking about how we can actually make sense of all of the data that we have in our organization and place it in different buckets. And here, one of the easiest examples for us to understand is when we're talking about PII, is when we're talking about this personally identifiable information. And one interesting thing is that, okay, I have one table, it can either not have any PII or have PII that it's non-sensitive or have PII that it's sensitive. And in this case, whenever we are creating a new classification, we can actually choose if these assets or these tags that we'll have in our classification are going to be mutually exclusive or not, which is actually going to help you, for example, define organizations such as if I have a table that is PII sensitive, it does not make sense for this table to also be PII non-sensitive. So again, when we are talking about classifications, we are talking about organizing and separating all of our data and putting it into different buckets that then we can explore and help us make sense of the different pieces of information that we have in our platform. On the other hand, we have the glossary. And when we're talking about the glossary, we're talking about how can we expand the information from our assets and manage it in a centralized place, right? How can we define the language that we all follow in our organization? Just to give an example, how do we make sense of a customer? What does it mean to have a customer in our organization, or a bank account, or a credit card? So you can actually define one or multiple glossaries in your organization where you can unify all of these different terms, all of these important pieces of language very much related to the business that then people can use to come make even more sense of the data and opens another door for you to discover data that you might be interested in. So for example, in this case, if I go into this general glossary, I have this ABN term, which is an Australian business number, and I can see that it has descriptions. I can specify what are other synonyms that actually make sense within my organization, how in which other ways I can identify the same business term. I can add external references. I can link other terms if needed. I can add even tags into this glossary. So that might be a very important difference between classifications and glossary terms, is that in terms we can actually link them to specific tags and classifications in our system. And as you can see, we can also make sense and very easily discover which assets might be related also to this glossary term. Now, a very powerful feature, and now I'm going to put the hat of a data steward or someone from the governance office, is, okay, I have these two separate worlds, one that is talking about the language of our organization, how we can define all of these different topics in the business, and the second world, which is the classifications and the tags on how I can actually organize the different pieces of information that I have in the platform. So let's take a look, for example, here at the credit card. No, so credit card might be a very big PII sensitive item, because if I have the number of the card, I might be able just to pull the thread and actually say, okay, so Pere might be the actual holder of that card. No, so one very important and powerful feature is that if we then add a tag to a glossary term, and now I'm going to jump into my table and I say, okay, this volume here might actually be talking about this credit card term. Whenever I apply this term into my asset, as you can see, the sensitive tag that I initially defined into my glossary term will be automatically applied. And this is a great way to have your first gap jumping in the business between the technical assets and your business domains, because not only you can actually now make more sense and understand a bit more the data that you might have in your platform, you are also ensuring that any specific classification, as important as when we are talking about PII tags, is not going to get lost. This business translation about, hey, actually the credit card is an asset that we might need to treat very, very carefully because it contains sensitive information. This breach is there thanks to this automated tagging of the assets. And not only that, let's imagine that then tomorrow we sit down with the rest of our governance team and we say, hey, actually the credit card, it should not only be linked to PII sensitive tagging, I might need to add something else. And then this something else could be, I don't know, just password to put something simple. And if I try to update this information, as you can see, it's giving me this pop-up, it's giving me this warning saying that this action will update the tag to all of the assets that are currently linked to the credit card. So I can accept that, might take a few seconds, and now let me refresh my page here. And as you can see, the password tag has automatically been added, has been automatically inherited from the credit card as a glossary term. And as you can see, we can also do it the other way around. Maybe we say, oh, actually, I messed it up. This password doesn't really make sense. The same way that we can keep adding all of these tags, it also makes sense that we can go back on our feed and just remove those tags whenever they don't make sense anymore. So as you can see, with glossary terms, we are not only expanding on these definitions, we are not only making it easier for business-oriented people to discover the assets that make sense of the data, we are also operationalizing this way of adding tags in bulk to all of those assets that might be related to glossary terms. Now, this is super powerful, right? But in the end, with great power comes great responsibility, right? How do we make sure that if we are changing a few things here and there, or that the glossaries that we are creating do actually make sense in our organizations? Because then maybe we have some permissions based on the PII sensitivity of our assets and whatnot. And as you know, you can also define these rules and policies directly within the platform. No? So we need to make sure that we have the right processes in place so that we can make sense on who can change what on the glossaries, and how can we create and review and validate that these pieces that we are adding in our glossary make all the sense that we expect them to make here. So one thing that we added in Collate, let me log in the new tab, was this workflows feature, which will help us actually make sense on what are the steps in our platform, what are the steps in Collate that we need to follow in order to create a new glossary term. How can we move that term from being created and being a draft to pass it to a state that anyone else in the organization can actually review that until it's approved. So in this workflows view, you can actually see all of these three. You can make sense of the different steps that we have. So let's take this for a spin. I will go back into my into my glossaries, and I will add here, for example, under the ACH transfer, I'm going to add a couple of new terms. And as you can see, in this case, I added myself as a reviewer, which means that any change that happens to this term or to the child terms that I can create into my glossary are going to need to be approved, in this case, by me. But you can add anyone else in your team or directly assign full teams that are going to be the custodians of these changes that are happening in the glossary. So in this case, I'm going to click here on Add, and I can very well link assets from this page too, but now I'm actually interested on playing a bit with this approval workflow when I try to add a new glossary term. So glossary term test 1, can give it a rather meaningful description. I save it, and as you can see, this term is yet not approved. I'm the owner, I created it. I'm waiting for someone to actually approve that term, but I won't be able to actually use this glossary term. If I go to my table and I come here and I find where did that live? It was living under financial services. Awesome. If I go under financial services, as you can see, ACH transfer does not have anything under it, does not have anything under it yet, because this term is still in draft. Someone needs to take care of that. Someone needs to actually approve it. But if I refresh the page, now see how it's not in draft anymore. It automatically moved into in review, and we have now this open task where the approval request for glossary term test 1 is pending. So let's try to make sense of this flow. Let's go back into our workflow UI to actually try to follow at which point the asset was moving from one box into the other. So first of all, we know that here, our ACH transfer term has a reviewer, right? So we are checking the first box. And then since I have a reviewer, the question is the glossary term ready to be reviewed or not? And here it's super powerful because we can play with these rules. We can actually define within our organization which steps are the ones that make sense that we follow in order to answer the question, is my glossary term ready to be reviewed or not? By default, we're just going to say, hey, if the description is set, we can go on. And since in this case, the description is set for my glossary term, I have already this task created. So now I can click on approving that. And if I refresh my page, I see already that my glossary term, that it's the child of the ACH transfer, is nice and approved. Now let's go back and let's try to play a bit more with this rule here. And maybe I want to add that, hey, every time that I create a glossary term, I actually need to inform a custom property that we have previously said about the legal entity that might be linked or might be defined, whatever it is that makes sense in our business. But this legal entity needs to be informed whenever we're defining this. Otherwise, really, we don't want to waste time. We don't want to start opening tasks and popping all of these endless conversations where our reviewers, our stewards are always prompting people to, hey, you actually need to add the legal entity. Let me know when that's done so that I can actually see if this makes sense or not. So we can make sure that we are properly defining which pieces of information, let me refresh so that it appears here, which are the different pieces of information that make sense for me before I can actually go on the task of creating all of these terms. So right now I'm going to create another one. Glossary term test 2. I'm adding the description, but I'm not going to add yet any custom property. So I could be refreshing and refreshing and waiting for as long as we need, because until we come and we change the legal entity custom property, this is never going to move into in review. So I can come and I can say So now change this. We are going to give a few seconds for the workflow to kick in, and it's coming and saying, okay, now this is ready to be reviewed. So if I go into my tasks, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to accept it. Now I have my glossary term green, nice, and approved. But something that is also very interesting is that if I go into my workflows and we check here in the configuration tab, the workflow triggers in two scenarios. One is when the glossary term is being created, but also when the glossary term is being updated. So if I now come here and I say, okay, I want to change the description for something different, this is going to trigger the workflow just in any second and move it to in review. It's going to create another task. This needs to be validated again because we came here and changed something that was previously approved. And if I actually come and I come here and I say, okay, I just want to remove my legal entity, and we give again the workflow a few seconds to kick in another time, it's going to say, hey, I'm actually now missing some important information for my business. I will just move this back to draft because we do need to validate something else before it can be reviewed. So as you can see, managing all the glossaries is a very, very, very important task. It helps us organize the business language. It helps us bridge all of these tags, all of these classifications into our technical assets as well. And thanks to these workflows definitions, thanks to this internal process picking up when things are being created, when things are being updated, you can make sure that no unintended changes are going to kick in until the reviewer comes and says, okay, this looks good to me. And so far, what we've seen is rather manual processes, no? Because I need to come, I either create my classifications, I create my glossaries, which does make sense for it to be manual because you need to define within your organization which are the important pieces that you want to reflect into this enterprise glossary that you're going to be defining here. But what happens if we really don't want to go into all of our tables and spend a lot of time into, okay, which volumes do I tag, which glossary terms do I specify into each and every of our cases? So let's see, in this case, how OpenMetadata can also help us into, let's say, smoothing out some of these experiences. So I have here this service, the meetup demo, and I barely just created a couple of services, a couple of ingestions, sorry. One is the metadata ingestion. You know that this one is the one that it's going to connect, in this case, into Redshift, extract all of the databases, the schemas, the tables, kind of make sense and try to organize all of the rich metadata that these sources have and bring that into OpenMetadata. And then the second one that we created here is actually a process that is brand new from the release 1.6, which is the auto classification ingestion. And this auto classification is actually going to do a couple of things for you. One is that you can actually toggle from here if you want to extract and store sample data from your services, so that whenever I'm going to go back, and I think I was looking at the orders table. Okay, I think that I have a lot of different services. Let me come directly from this view. So if I go into my orders table, if I do want to enable the sample data view, which I think I did on the customers table, perfect. So if we want to actually make it easier for whoever is discovering this data, they can come here, and after taking a look at the schema and making sense of these technical definitions of the data, they might actually want to see a small taste on how the data might look like. So you can control that with the store sample data toggle, and you can also do that to enable auto classification. And some of you, if you have already been here for a few releases, these pieces, you might remember about, oh, I think that this was before on the profiler workflow, and you are completely correct. In the 1.6 release, we actually took that out of the profiler. We are creating this other workflow to make it easier to actually customize and figure out and apply all the filters and whatnot, and make sure that we can keep evolving these auto classification features here. So you have this as a separate workflow that you can play, and you can define, hey, do I want to store the sample data, or do I want to enable this auto classification? And with this auto classification, you can actually achieve the following. When I have my sensitive customers table, and this process is going to work in two ways. One is that it's going to scan the names of the column. So in this case, it's saying, hey, this looks like it's talking about users. This looks like it's talking about social security numbers, addresses, and whatnot. So we try to make sense. We have some internal rules that try to make sense as much as possible about which kind of information we can expect this data to hold based on the column names. But we also have an AI process on top of it, which, thanks to entity recognition models, we can actually say, okay, this column does not really make any sense name-wise. And we all know that in engineering, naming things might be one of the most difficult things, and we did a really, really poor job in this case. But if I go and now I take a look at the sample data, I'm going to see that, okay, this data warehouse underscore X10 column does indeed contain some email addresses. So what these NLP models are going to do is they are going to actually scan the sample data. They are going to recognize that we are talking about emails, and indeed, emails are PII sensitive information. Now, something that is very powerful and very important for you to know, even if for whatever reason, compliance, regulations, privacy, whatever it is that makes sense in your organization, you do want to benefit from this auto classification, because again, just doing all of this work from a blank canvas takes a lot of work, and you will keep having new tables, new sources that you are trying to bring into OpenMetadata as well. And doing this first pass via an automation, it's going to free a lot of time from your hands. But even if you say, hey, I want to have this auto classification enabled, but I do not want to spill any of the beans about my sample data, you can directly come here, disable the sample data to be stored, and we will still use during the process these few rows that we are getting to validate these entities, to recognize the shape and the entities behind this data, and we are going to send the tagging process, but we are not going to store the sample data directly in there. So this is actually something that we did not really have ready, or it wasn't really maybe that easy to configure when we were in the profiler. And now that we have this separate auto classification workflow, it is super simple, super straightforward how you can make sense of all of these different toggles. So this would be one possible way on how you can scale your team, scale your processes, while still maintaining some safety net about, at least I know that even if it's an automation, someone is looking at the PII sensitivity of my data. But then, as you might remember, in Collate, we have these automations, this governance automations feature, which I actually like to think about that as governance recipes. No, and in this case, the same way that we can come into our services and prepare, there we go, come into the services and prepare all of these different workflows that we say, hey, I want this metadata extraction or profiling or lineage or whatnot to be executed every day, every week, whenever it fits our use case. We can actually now do the same in a governance perspective. And I can come here and I'm going to tie this back into the previous examples about the glossaries and the classification. So I'm going to add now an automation that it's going to, first of all, navigate some of the tables that we might have. We can choose each kind of asset that we might need, but in this case, just to follow up the examples, I'm going to select a table. I'm going to filter this table and say, hey, I actually want to apply this automation into my meetup demo service. And for example, I only want to what I will try to do here is to add a glossary term. But this glossary term, I want to add it only on those tables that might have this bank transfer amount column. And then we have a set of actions that we can configure. So what do I want to do on top of these three assets that the automation is going to be tackling? And as you can see, this is very, very handy because it already shows us and helps us understand, okay, which assets am I about to update? No? So we can click here, we can double check, okay, those three tables kind of make sense for me. And then I'm going to say, hey, I want to add some tags. And in this case, I do want to add a glossary term about the credit card. I'm going to add the glossary term, but I actually do not want to add it on the table itself because I'm actually filtering by this bank transfer amount column. So I do want to apply this glossary term to the column itself. So I'm going to apply it to the children, select the right column, click on next, schedule it. I want this to run every week. But since I'm not very, very patient, I'm just going to trigger it now. But as you can see, this is a very powerful way to say, hey, today I might only have three tables that contain this column. But maybe next week, next month, next quarter, whenever it is that we keep growing our data platform, I might have other tables or any other asset that is also following this set of rules. So by properly defining and leveraging these automations, you can actually make sure that whatever it is that changes in the future is also going to be following these same recipes. And this unlocks a very, very, very huge potential because, as we know, data assets, they grow in a certain rate, but our governance teams, they are not growing linearly with the assets. And all the time they will need to take care and maintain and document and understand a growing number of tables or services, databases, whatever it is that we are playing in our organization, right? So by leveraging these automations, we can actually take one step back and say, okay, I don't want to go case by case. I want to define this set of rules. I want to define all of these recipes and make sure that they get properly applied through time. And now if I click here again, I'm going to take a look at my orders processed. As you can see, the column that we selected has applied the credit card term. And since we know that the credit card term was properly linked into this PII sensitive tag, that was inherited as well. And this, I think, it's one great example that we have. But before calling it a day or calling it a year at this stage, I do want to show you one last very, very powerful automation that we have under this automations feature as well, which is the lineage propagation. Because let's take a look at this. It's very simple, but it's very representative, no? Whenever we're talking about, I'm building a data lake house, a nice organized data warehouse, whatever it is that you're building, you will get data from your transactional tables, put it in raw, you might call it raw, you might call it someone else, no? But in the end, you just move that data, you keep cleaning, transforming, aggregating all of these results, just making a bit of more business sense of whatever it is that the backends or any other services are bringing you. But as you can see, if I zoom just a tiny bit here, I have my ID, first name, and last name columns that exist from my raw customers to the staging customers to the customers table to the new customers table. As you can see, not a lot of imagination, but hopefully the example is representative. And what I want to discuss here is from a governance perspective. Do we really want to do the work in this case 4 times? And that's just a very little example about, do I really need to document all of these columns and their metadata into 4 different places times whatever number of growing services and lineages and whatnot that you might have in your organization? Or can we say, hey, I was able to identify via these automated lineage workflows and whatnot, or DBT, basically all of these other nice pieces that the ingestion framework of OpenMetadata is bringing us. I have been able to identify this source of truth. Why cannot I just define the right metadata into my source of truth and let it flow? No, let it just move from table to table to table, just passing along all of these important pieces of information. So let's try to do that. I'm going to come here into my raw customers table. Okay, and in this case, I'm going to add something into my ID. Okay, I'm just going to define whatever is going on into this ID. I'm just whatever, these couple of tags. I'm going to add these tags, and I'm going to add a nice description. So if I actually took my job seriously, this might have already taken a good few minutes on figuring out the right tags and description and whatnot, no? So now I can come back into my governance automations. I will add a new automation. We'll call it Lineage propagation. I will select again my tables, figure out, in this case, I will just shoot it against or my meetup demo service, which I have just prepared for that. Did I inform the right table? Yes, meetup demo, awesome. And here in the action list, I'm going to choose lineage propagation, and we have some nice toggles. No? And this is also something that we improved quite a bit in 2.16, where you can choose, hey, do I want to propagate column pieces or just the actual main asset pieces? In this case, I'm the most interested onto my column level lineage. That's where 80% of my work, 90% of the work I'm sinking time in, and I'm going to propagate description, terms, and tags. And going to click on next. I do want to make sure also that this at least runs once per week so that all of our metadata is nice and updated. But since I am not patient, I'm just going to trigger it now. See, now it's already queued. And what I expect is that, let me refresh this page too, so that we have the updated pieces on the right. So I'm expecting that these new random tags and description that I added on my raw customers table, they automatically appear, and looks like this ran before that I could actually show this. So this process is already kicking in, and it's saying, hey, this description and tags that we added to the raw customers have been propagated to the staging customers, have been not yet propagated. Let's see if I refresh now, if it's going to appear. Yes, awesome. Have been propagated to my customers table, and finally have been propagated to my new customers table. So as you can see, this process was smart enough to figure out how many hops do we need to do, what's the right information that we need to move from table to table to table to table, and it just took us a few clicks. And if it helped me save a bunch of time in this very simple example, just imagine the amount of huge effort that you can actually offload from your governance teams, and you can actually help them properly scale and properly automate, quote unquote, the tedious part of the job, which is, okay, which are the rules that do make sense into my organization, or where is the place that we can actually make the most benefit out of putting the time into documenting and adding all of these tags and glossaries. So as you can see, there's a lot of features that both OpenMetadata and Collate are bringing on the table, a lot of different ways that you can actually tackle this problem about how we can apply not only the right definitions and the right tags into our assets, even if we need to analyze them one by one, as well as how can we make use of these automations, be it directly from the ingestions in the service, or be it directly with these metadata automation details.